Well, hello. So glad we have the opportunity to continue our study in Ecclesiastes. We are getting really into the bulk of the word. We're getting into Ecclesiastes chapter 5 with an opportunity on Tuesday to talk about the fourth chapter of Ecclesiastes. We got to dive into Cole's continued discussion of labor, the differences between mankind, the issues of understanding God's perspective. And he's going to continue that narrative thread through here into chapter 5. He's going to have a lot of good stuff to say, particularly about our attitude towards God. And then later in the chapter, talking about, again, this continued relationship of man to his labor. And so very excited to dive into this. We're again joined with Trey Haskett from Tupelo, Mississippi, Greg Kline from Birmingham, Alabama. Appreciate both of you guys continuing to be in this study with us. Very excited to dive into this. And so we're going to go ahead and dive right into it in chapter 5. We're going to start in verse 1. And so it reads for us, "Guard your steps as you go to the house of God and draw near to listen, rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools. For they do not know they are doing evil. Do not be hasty in word or impulsive in thought to bring up matter in the presence of God. For God is in heaven and you are on the earth. Therefore, let your words be few. For the dreams come through much effort and the voice of a fool through many words. When you make a vow to God, do not be late in paying it, for he takes no delight in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Do not let your speech cause you to sin, and do not say in the presence of the messenger of God that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry on account of your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For in many dreams and in many words there is emptiness. Rather fear God." So in these first 7 verses, we have probably the most explicit mention so far of what we've seen of the relationship and the understanding of the preacher's views on God. Up until this point, we've seen him kind of talking a lot about kind of the empirical evidence before him. He's talked a lot about how you view things and how you work things. Here, he's really kind of showing his hand and making it clear he is a believer in God. He is a knowledgeable person about God. And so he's now kind of transitioning and pivoting into the direct relationship with God and the believer. And he's talked about this in some capacity before. He's mentioned it in, I think, a lot in chapter 3 with the discussion of time and of the difference between how God views time and how we view time. He's talked about the idea of God correcting injustice. Now he's getting into the heart of the proper relationship of the wise man with the fool. And I think he again gets a really good point for us to consider in verse 2, where he says, "For God is in heaven and you are on the earth. Therefore, let your words be few." We saw him again in chapter 3 emphasize that human perspective is limited. Human perspective, as we use that analogy of the tapestry, we can sometimes see the little weaves and the little notes and everything, but we have a hard time comprehending the entirety of creation, the entirety of God's magnificence. And here again, we see the preacher making the point that there is a distinct difference between mankind and between the God in heaven. And so that knowledge, that understanding of the difference between man and God, that should inform our behavior before the Lord. And so to the preacher, the big takeaway is that you need to let your words be few. In other words, you should be listening more than you're talking. The fool understands that in many words, there tends to be a lot of mistakes. There tends to be a lot of errors in that. And so one of the benefits of having the word of God preserved for us like it is that we can let God do the bulk of the talking and we accept what he says. Our words are comparatively few in sight of his. And so understanding that distinction between man and God, I think, is a critical thing. Trey, what do you see in these first 7 verses that you worth highlighting?
One of the things I want to point out here is you mentioned how there's sort of this transition and the preacher here is showing his hand about his relationship with God. And not only is there a transition from the way that he goes about talking about the things that he's seeing and the things that he's observing with his eyes and at times this very pessimistic outlook on life, but also in the language that he's using. So, as we read through these first 8 verses here of chapter 5, one of the things that we kind of get this glimpse of, or maybe it even sounds very familiar to us, this language is pretty similar to what we read, for instance, in Proverbs, which when we think of wisdom literature, that's typically what we're thinking of as the book of Proverbs. And we're getting some of those statements that are pretty similar to what he says in that book. And one of those things that's very evident in the book of Proverbs that he's bringing out here is that God is worthy of worship, and that the wise choice is, and the right choice, because those are the same thing, the right choice and the right choice, is to worship God, and is to worship him with a pure heart. And I think, when he talks about listening there, and sort of this idea of being slow to speak, quick to hear, maybe like what James talks about there in James chapter 1, when he talks about this idea of listening, it's really pregnant with that way that the Hebrews would talk about listening. And so there's the one level of listening where we hear, but there's also that second level of listening where we obey. And that's part of this contrast here. Any fool can go and make a sacrifice, can offer an animal, but it takes the wise type of person who's really going to obey God and follow God and do what he would have to say, rather than just offering all these rash vows that you really don't intend to keep, that are not consummate and in line with the style of life that you're living. And so part of what he's pushing the readers and the hearers to do is to be the type of people who really truly listen, who follow God, who do what biblical wisdom would have us do, and that is walk in the fear of the Lord. And so that's what I see a lot here as we think about worship, is that worship cannot be separated from our life, and that what it means to listen to God is not only to understand what he says, but then also to go out and to do it. Greg, maybe you have some more to add on some of that.
I certainly think you all have done a good job in laying out the foundations of the need to be sincere, to be a people of our word, and certainly to fear God appropriately. But even in a larger perspective here, the idea of making a covenant before God, not just on, let's say, a Sunday morning or on a Sabbath day. When you make a commitment to be a Christian, for example, you're making a covenant with God, that you're accepting his terms as the better, his offer of salvation, and that you will do anything and everything in self-sacrifice. Jesus would say in Luke 9, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow after me. That is a continual promise we make when we confess Jesus. And sometimes we tend to, in this society, boil down a little too simplistically what God expects. To confess Jesus isn't just to go out loud and shout, I believe in Jesus. Right? There's a commitment behind that. And when we see in verse 1, to draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice for fools, for they don't know that they are doing is evil. It doesn't necessarily just mean that only fools offer these sacrifices. It's speaking even of the ignorant. And I have to be careful to make sure that I take advantage of that word that Andrew mentioned that we have before us, and make sure I'm not ignorant, because God takes worship seriously. God takes commitment seriously. And so our commitments in our marriages, and certainly our commitment to Christ, has to be taken with the utmost sincerity. And when we do that, the rest falls in line. So let me illustrate that. When we put Christ first, then I'm more apt to do what? Verse 2, well, to not be rash with my mouth. I'm willing to listen to make sure I don't speak or offer out of ignorance. And certainly I will change my speech. I will change my approach. I will change my love of others and lower self on the totem pole of priorities. And so what do you see? Well, when you come down to verse 6, it would help me with this. Let not your mouth lead you into sin, and do not say before the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? Sin and a lack of commitment creates all kinds of problems for us. And let's be honest, there's a common phrase that a lot of us have heard and used: talk is cheap. Well, to God, it's not. And we need to be very careful. Jesus says that we will answer for every careless word that we speak and will be brought into judgment. That's powerful. But this isn't just a warning of a negative idea. There's also some positivity here. We should be people of our word. That means when we say something, we'll do it. On what basis? On the basis that God keeps his promises. If we want God to be sincere and real with us the way he is, because God is faithful and just, then we have to be faithful to others too, and including in our word. And so there's a lot of honesty here, but also realizing the importance of life. Keep in mind, in this overall journey, there's this, well, what are we doing? What are we here for? Well, no matter what the application of finding purpose in life is, take God seriously, take commitments to him in word, thought, and deed with the utmost sincerity, and let him guide our steps. I think as you look at that, that really fits in with the overall message. And certainly that's going to match his conclusion, to fear God and keep his commandments no matter what. So we're going to move on to this next section, beginning in verse 8, and hope you read along verses 8 through 17. If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter, for the high official is watched by a higher, and there are yet higher ones over them. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. There is a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. And he is the father of a son, but he has nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again, naked as he came, and shall take nothing for his toil, that he may carry away in his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. And what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Moreover, all his days he eats in darkness, and much vexation and sickness and anger. Andrew, I'm going to go ahead and let you have the first crack at this. What do you see that stands out in his journey here to finding that purpose of life?
Yeah, I think it's significant that you see a couple different things here. You see in verse 8 and 9 the continuation of what he's been talking about with this idea of injustice. And I think it's important what he says here. He's kind of drawing a contrast to verse 8 and 9. Verse 8 is the reality. He says, when you see oppression of the poor and denial of justice and righteousness, do not be shocked at the sight. He makes the point that this is what's the expected. The expected thing is that officials abuse their power, and where one official is, there's somebody higher than him who's continuing that cycle of abuse, and it typically goes all the way to the top. And I think sometimes we, particularly as Americans, can think that, well, this certainly applied in the olden days, but it's not really talking about us. There's not really oppression in our world today. There's really not, this type of systemic corruption of everything. And I think the preacher would probably laugh at us and say, you're just not seeing it. Just because you're not experiencing it yourself, you're not aware of it, doesn't mean that these things don't go on. And sometimes I think we're surprised to hear that, a senator has been caught up in a scandal of economic injustice, or, this big corporation has been doing these terrible things, whatever. And we're like, man, who would think that these things would happen? And the preacher would be like, well, of course that's what happens. Power corrupts, economic practices, the pursuit of money as the chief goal of life. All of those things are to be expected. That's the evil that mankind engages in. Him. And then in verse 9, he says, almost kind of a flip of that. He says, after all, a king who cultivates the land is an advantage to the land. And he's kind of setting up this reality that when a king, when the government does what it's supposed to do, that's a benefit to the people. When a land is run justly, when principle continues these things and principle upholds the law, that's a benefit. And so this is obviously kind of a salient conversation to a lot of the things that have been going on in our culture over the past few weeks, where we have we've talked a lot about justice. We've heard a lot of talk about oppression and all these things. And I think the preacher gives us an understanding that, yeah, we shouldn't be surprised to hear that there's oppression. We shouldn't be surprised to hear that there is difficulty, that there is injustice in our land. That's what should be expected. It's what every nation that's ever been described has faced, these difficulties of injustice and oppression. And so I think Cahaba kind of fits into the broader picture of this by telling us that, yeah, you shouldn't be surprised to see these things. And it is better for a government to be just. Now, certainly there's a lot of application, a lot of questions. Okay, well, what exactly does that mean for us as far as how do we pursue those things? And the prophets, I think, talk a lot about the need to cry out for justice, the need to stand up for the rights of the oppressed. But I think this particular passage offers us an understanding that we should not be surprised to see oppression. We should not be surprised that authority and power and wealth are corrupting influences. And that's really what he's going to continue to talk about in 10 through 17, is how wealth can corrupt even the most best of intentions. And so, Trey, what do you see going on in the rest of these passages here?
Yeah, Andrew, I think your comments were so spot on, and particularly pointing out verse 9 that we can tend to overreact and say, well, government and officials and people in high places, well, they're just all corrupt, so let's just do away with all of them. And no, the preacher comes back to say there's actually good in these things. But the reality is that money often does corrupt. And The reason why that is so is because we're never going to be satisfied. And that's what he says in verse 10. If money is our goal, if having more possessions, having larger houses, driving faster cars, whatever it is for us, the nice pair of shoes or whatever it is that we're looking for, if that is where we're looking for sustenance and fulfillment, we're never going to be satisfied. We're always going to be looking for more. Greg, I think you pointed this out last week, but the eyes, they're never going to be satisfied with what they look at and what they long for. And so if that is the paradigm through which we are going through life, just to gain more and to get more, we are never going to be in a place where we are content with what we have. And so now you're in a position of power, and that's who you are. Well, you're only going to grasp and claw and grab and scratch and fight for more power, more money, more wealth. And what happens at the end of that is that those who are without are pushed down even further. But as Andrew mentioned, that's not just about the people in power. That's just not about the people that are in high position or that have high status or high wealth. That's about me too. And that's about a lot of us, I think, especially within the culture that we live in. I mean, look, Amazon, I can click a button and it's on my doorstep 2 days later. That is pretty remarkable. Even, I mean, some of you probably during this quarantine, you may have got the notification like it may not be here for a couple weeks, and then maybe it was like 3 days that it showed up, and we're cannot believe it. No, but seriously, we have so much more than what we could ever want, and if we just keep feeding that, I think we fall into this cycle of continuing to want and never being satisfied. And so, what is the answer? And I think ultimately he's going to get to that here in a little bit. But I do think there is a perspective that he's looking through, a lens that he's looking through here, verses 13 through 17. Greg, maybe you want to say more about that.
Yeah, I think even in verse 12, there's a key here. When it comes to Amazon, by the way, you have this whole concept of 2 days. Remember when it used to be 1 to 2 weeks? And now if someone says 1 to 2 weeks, I'm like, I'm not buying from them, because we have so much money and we can make things so simple that we think we've got it figured out. By the way, it took a virus to teach us all we have no control. We have nothing figured out, and our wonderful ecosystem can crash in a moment. And really, so that you look at that and you say, okay, well, wealth can go away. And you really see that in verse 13 through 17. And even if you keep it your entire life, even if you can have that mythical, magical 1 day prime shipping your entire life, eventually it stops when your life does. And so we're back to that age-old question from the book of Ecclesiastes. What is the purpose? What's the point? What do we do? Well, verse 12 has the key. In the midst of this, vanity of vanities type of section, in verse 12, sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. It's ironic that the laborer, relative to the rich man, is considered the one to not struggle with anxiety, the one who is, here's our magic word, always content. Being content is hard because we always see newer, better, faster. But God says he made us a particular way. And from this study, one of the things I hope we see is as we go through that wealth will not satisfy, yes, and that's true. And the love of money is evil, yes, that is true. In 1 Timothy, we know that. But there is something we are supposed to be thankful for and doing, and that is working. You work hard, you do your best, whether the riches pile up or they stay low. Notice that in verse 12, whether you eat little or much, your sleep is sweet. Now, as someone who doesn't have a newborn in my house, my sleep tends to be very sweet, and I enjoy that. But when you are tired after working a long day or taking care of your family, all of a sudden that becomes that much more valuable. And so the question is not, are riches bad? That's not what's under consideration. It is what matters, what brings peace. And that, of course, is always going to be God. You go back to verse 1, guard your steps when you go to near to the house of God. Focus on him first. What has he done? Going back to chapter 3, he has allowed us to enjoy our labor. We don't think of it that way. We think of riches as the goal. God says, no, your reward is your labor itself. That's tricky because when you're tired, you think, what kind of reward is that? But that's the way God sees it. We have to train ourselves to look the way God does. A human, relatably, looks at verse 13 and says, there's a grievous evil I have seen. Riches were kept by the owner to his hurt. Now, we can see all kinds of degradations in society when the top 1%, quote unquote, keeps wealth and doesn't help. And there's debates on this. Point is, we've seen people who have been overly stingy, who have not loved the poor. of not taking care of others. I need to make sure I'm one of those people who are helping myself. Verse 16, again, worldly view. This is also a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. And what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Moreover, all his days he eats in darkness and much vexation and sickness and anger. If we don't live for the right things, there is no joy. There is no peace. There is no being content. And so when we look at our life and we're constantly anxious and struggling and not content, the question is not, why is God doing this to me? The question is, am I accepting what God has offered? When I look at his plan, am I trusting him? Am I working? Am I living out the life God wants me to? Sacrificing self to help others, and most importantly, put him first. Now, Trey, would you mind reading this last section? I think it summarizes it pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. So beginning in verse 18, it says, "Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment, and all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them, to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God. So he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart." And so which is it? Because what we've just read is that it's a grievous evil that the preacher is seeing, that people will gain wealth, but they can't enjoy it, and they're just all going to die anyways. But then he kind of turns, and now he's given a different perspective. And this is something we've seen as we've gone throughout this book, is that the preacher really is giving sort of two perspectives on life. There is the one perspective which looks through life, looks at life just based on what we can see and what we observe around us, and we see the injustice, we see the evil, we see that everybody meets death, and that can be a very depressing and pessimistic view, albeit a realistic view of the world. There's another view of life, which is one which includes God as the answer to all of that. And so that's what we see here. And when we do that, you notice verse 18, it says, "What I've seen to be good and fitting," at least the ESV reads that way. Probably that word fitting is more to be understood something like beautiful. In fact, you look it up in your Bible, and this word is talked about beautiful houses, beautiful people, beautiful things. It is good and it is beautiful to enjoy our food and our drink and the labor, the toil that God has given us. And so that's the type of people we need to be, people who look at life and see that here is an opportunity for me to take what God has given me, take this time, take this moment, take these resources, take these relationships, and to delight in them and to enjoy them. We've made this point before, because the Ecclesiastes writer, or at least the preacher, has made this point before, that life is to be lived, number one, before God and thanking him for everything that he's given. But number two, it's to be lived with other people and to enjoy the people and the experiences and the things that God has given us. And so what we're not saying here, and what the Ecclesiastes writer and what the preacher here is not saying, is that just trust God and that everything's going to be okay, or that all your problems are going to go away, or that somehow the death and the injustice and all of the depressing things we might face in life. He's not saying just trust God and all of those things are just going to vanish like hevel or smoke or vapor. No, life still has those realities. It doesn't change what life looks like, but it does change how we look at life. And I think that's the key here. It's about how we perceive what's going on in this world and how we look at the moments that God has given us. And so I've said a lot there. Greg, do you want to give us some application here on this chapter?
Yeah, I think the way you put that is really strong. And when you look at verse 19, there's this continuing theme again. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God. I can't move off of that. Again, not just the wealth and possessions, but to rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God. That is countercultural. That is not normal. We could say, oh, I could rejoice in wealth. I could rejoice in possessions. Well, we've already seen in this chapter, in addition to other parts of this book, that doesn't last at best, and it doesn't satisfy at worst. But God gave us a gift, and that is including rejoicing in our toil. That is powerful because that means I have to look at the world differently. And to look at the world differently means a completely changed mind. In verse 20, it really highlights this. For he will not much remember the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. That does not mean, as Trey rightly said, that bad things don't happen. But where are we occupied? Or if you can allow me this correction, preoccupied. Well, what does God do? God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. What do I see? Am I fixated on negatives, on bad things? We sometimes have to do that. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, you'd think I would know the name of the book by now. There is a time to mourn. There's a time to weep. That doesn't mean that it's only for a good thing that we would mourn or weep. No, sometimes bad things happen. But where is our fixation? Well, if my fixation verses 1 through 7 is on God, I can stand well before judgment, knowing that he is merciful, knowing that he is forgiving. If my focus in verse 12 is to work and to do my part, I can know that I can sleep well. Why? Because verse 18, 19, and 20, God wants us to have this type of peace. He wants us to have this joy, to not be focused down here, but rather up above. As Paul might say, set your mind on things above. And so as we think about this is very application heavy. Andrew, why don't you begin wrapping us up, not only with your thoughts on this section, but even our takeaway for the day.
Yeah, I think when you see this final section here in 18 through 20, the word that kind of stands out for me is sometimes translated reward, but that word lot. That's a really important word, a really heavy word for us, because our lot in life, a lot of times in our culture, and we've been talking a lot about how this is a countercultural chapter. Our chapters our culture tends to emphasize you exceeding your lot, you growing beyond it, you being able to do more. One of the fascinating things I was reading in a commentary, a Harvard psychologist was quoted as saying that when you emerge out of poverty into basically having enough, kind of that we typically call it kind of the middle class, there's a boost in poverty. There's a boost in happiness getting out of poverty. But after that, there's really no evidence of a greater happiness going above and beyond the daily necessities of life. That the richer you get, it doesn't necessarily mean you're getting any happier. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in accepting your lot in life. We talked about, as we look at the whole chapter, Kolef makes the point, you're going to face oppression. You're going to face economic frustrations. You're going to have, as he's talked about in the previous chapter, you may build up this great business empire and then it collapses because the guy behind you is an entity. You may find that you have done everything that you need to be doing and it just doesn't work very well. But where you find contentment is not in the end result of success, because that's not going to follow you anyway after death. What you take contentment in is your lot in life and doing with it what is wise to do with your lot in life. You toil, you rejoice in the good things of life, you take the opportunities to rejoice. And that's one of the things that I think the preacher is making the point of, is that he makes it clear that even in the worst of circumstances, even in a world that is beset by oppression, even in a world that is beset by greed and the lust after money, even in the worst of circumstances, there are opportunities to rejoice in joy. There's opportunities to rejoice in a good night's sleep. There's opportunities to rejoice in a hard day's work. There's opportunities to rejoice that you have enough bread to get by for the day. And so even in the most humble of circumstances, we can find the opportunity to go to the house of the Lord and present ourselves approved and present ourselves in a joyous manner, thankful to God for fulfilling our relationship with him. And doesn't that sound exactly like what Paul talks about, that I have found myself in every circumstance to be able to be content? And I think that's really one of the big takeaways from this chapter, is that even with the havel of life, even with the vanity of life, we still have the ability to find contentment so long as we prioritize the Lord. Greg, what do you see here as kind of a takeaway here for this chapter?
I love the idea of rejoicing in what we have, being thankful. That's so important. And one of the interesting things from the writer's quest in this book is how he goes back and forth and he sees the world and he sees problems, and we can relate to that. And he can be hung up on those problems and we can relate to that. But God makes it clear that his expectation for us has never been to be here forever. And so that overlays this entire chapter. Because I am not here forever, I should be extra careful when I what? Verses 1 through 7. Well, worship and honor God. How I live, faithful to my word. not making rash vows, doing whatever it takes to please him. In the second section, right, when I see that which is unjust, when I see people afflicted, should I stand up and vocalize that? Yes, that shouldn't make us feel good, but we should expect that because this world is not permanent. It is not our home. And so what do? I need to do my part. I need to live my role and be satisfied that God knows what is best for me. So verse 12, sweet is the sleep of a laborer. And certainly verse 18 through 20, accept the gift of God. The greatest gift of God undoubtedly is the grace and mercy and the sacrifice of Jesus. But notice even that phrase that we often talk about, the gift of God that we should accept, is applied in verse 19 to not only good things, but even to rejoicing in our toil. If we could choose to look at a world and say, there are so many blessings that God has given us, rather than so many things I don't have or that I want or that would be great, it's going to change our lives. And Lord willing, it would help us to be, in the words of Jesus, a light that others might see our good works and glorify our Father who is in heaven. Wonderful chapter with some wonderful challenges. It's hard to control the tongue. It's hard to control our thoughts, but it's worth it. And God has a plan for us. Trey, as we work towards wrapping up here, what do you see as some takeaways practically for the end of the chapter? And then we'll let Andrew sign us off.
Yeah, I think one of the things here, if I can just jump back to that first section, I need to be very careful about how I approach God, that contrast that Andrew pointed out, that we sort of sit in silence before God because he is who he is and we are who we are. And so not being hasty with our mouth or with our heart to just speak irrationally and imprecisely about him. I need to be very careful about how I speak about God and how I approach him in worship. God is a God of grace, and God is a God that wants to have an intimate relationship with us, and he is our Father, and all of that is true, but he's also a God who is holy and who is wholly above us. And so I need to be very careful how I approach him in worship. I know that's kind of where we started, and this chapter ends a little bit in a different place, but that was just one thing that jumped out to me is how we approach worship matters. And so I need to be very careful about that.
Guys, I think that's a great place to wrap it up. And this chapter and really the whole book, I think we've seen so much good application, and it's why we wanted to study this book. It's why we wanted to take a look at the wisdom literature. There's just so much in the Old Testament that reveals, I think, the will of God, that reveals the mindset of God. And Ecclesiastes is a great book for that. Thank you guys so much for joining on the study. Appreciate everybody's good thoughts. Appreciate everybody who continues to watch these videos, continues to put up with the antics of 3 former college roommates. And we hope it's beneficial. We hope that you continue to study these things. Lord willing, we will have the opportunity, perhaps on Friday, to talk about Ecclesiastes chapter 6, a little bit of a shorter chapter, but no less the rich for it. And so we look forward to that. And so again, Lord willing, we hope to see you on Friday. Thank you so much. See you then.